There's a lot that the world is expecting President Xi and President Trump to resolve. A trade war, a closed oil choke point as in the Strait of Hormuz, a $700 billion economic relationship, and a small island called Chinese Taipei that could start a world war. To understand why this meeting is happening, it's important to also understand why the US-China relationship is the most consequential bilateral relationship in the entire world. China is one of only 2 nations on Earth with a nuclear arsenal large enough to pose a significant threat to the US. It is the only nation that could displace the US as the world's leading power, with 4 times America's population, an economy that has already overtaken the US in purchasing power terms, and the title of the world's largest manufacturer. It is the number 1 trading partner of most countries on Earth, including the EU and Japan. And it is also, at the same time, America's most indispensable economic partner. Graham Allison, the Harvard professor who coined the term Thucydides' trap that Xi Jinping referred to in his speech as well, describes China as both America's greatest rival and its inseparable conjoined Siamese twin. Together, the 2 economies make up 43% of global GDP and nearly half of all global manufacturing output. And here's the detail that stops most people cold. China holds $760 billion in US Treasury bonds, making it America's 2nd largest foreign creditor in the world after Japan. You can't fully sanction the country that is financing your debt. So, on today's dossier, let's take a look at how the US and China became such entangled rivals. Let's start from 1972. Richard Nixon, the most anti-communist president in American history, flies to Beijing and shakes hands with Mao Zedong. Side note, Pakistan helped make that happen. So the visit ends 25 years of total isolation between the 2 countries, but it also sets off a chain reaction that has never really stopped ever since. But here's the thing that most people forget. When Nixon landed in Beijing, China was a poor, largely agricultural country that was still scarred by the Cultural Revolution. It was a bipolar world with the USSR being the other power. There was only one giant and one country that Washington thought it could bring into its own orbit. That bet, and I'll tell you in a bit why I'm calling it a bet, was simple. Open China up, trade with it, integrate it into the global economy, and it will eventually become more like the US. As in, it will liberalize, it will democratize, and the market will do what armies couldn't. For the next 3 decades, every president doubled down on that bet. Reagan went in 1984, George Bush visited China 1 month after being sworn in, Bill Clinton made a 9-day trip in 1998 and paved the way for China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. And the logic was always the same: more engagement, more stability. It seemed to be working. By 2001, US-China trade was booming. American companies were building factories across China. Chinese goods were flooding Walmart shelves, and the 2 economies were becoming so intertwined that some economists started calling them one entity, Chimerica. Then something shifted. In 2008, the global financial crisis hits, the US economy craters, but China bounces back almost immediately. And for the first time, the world starts doing the math differently. China isn't just catching up, China is overtaking. 25 years ago, the US was the world's largest exporter, selling $729 billion in goods annually. China ranked 4th at about 1/3 of that. But today, China exports $3.59 trillion in goods every year, nearly double America's $1.9 trillion. Today, 145 countries trade more with China than with the United States. 25 years ago, only 30 did. And that's why I called it a bet, because whatever the US wanted to achieve did work, but just not in the way that they imagined it. The market didn't make China more like America, it made China a rival of its own. So when Obama comes in, he pivots. In 2011, he announces a strategic rebalance to Asia, which is diplomatic language for we need to start taking China seriously as a competitor. He hosts Xi Jinping at the Sunnylands estate in California in 2013. 8 hours of informal talks trying to establish personal chemistry before the rivalry hardens completely. They agree to curb state-sponsored cyber espionage. It feels briefly like the relationship can still be managed. Then China starts building artificial islands in the South China Sea, turning reefs into military bases, claiming sovereignty over waters. The US sends warships through. Beijing objects. The pattern is set. Assertion and counter-assertion again and again in one of the world's most critical shipping lanes. And then comes Trump. First term, 2017. He arrives in Beijing with Melania on his arm, a Forbidden City tour, a Peking opera, a state dinner, and a $250 billion in announced deals. He calls Xi a very special man. Washington exhales. But as expected, that warmth lasts less than a year. In 2018, Trump launches the most aggressive trade war in modern history. Tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars in Chinese goods. China retaliates. The goodwill of the Forbidden City evaporates almost overnight. Then COVID happens. Trump calls it the China virus. Mistrust reaches levels not seen since before Nixon. In 2020, the two countries expel each other's diplomats. Both sides close consulates. A Chinese spy balloon drifts across the entire continental United States in 2023 before the Air Force shoots it down. By the time Trump returns for his second term, the relationship is, by almost any measure, at its lowest point since 1972. His administration imposes tariffs that peak at 145%. China retaliates with rare earth export controls, throttling the materials needed for semiconductors, defense systems, and electric vehicles. Chinese exports to the US fall nearly 20% in a year. In 2024, the US bought $453 billion worth of goods from China, machinery, electronics, the components inside almost every device in your home. China remains America's third largest trading partner. Despite every tariff, every ban, every hostile speech, the trade keeps flowing. Because the alternative, full decoupling, would mean inflation, shortages, and economic pain that no politician in either country actually wants to absorb. When tariffs pushed inflation up by 0.5 percentage point in the US in the summer of 2025, Washington felt it. When rare earth controls choked American and European manufacturers, Beijing felt the blowback as well. A fragile truce was reached in South Korea in October 2025. The most punishing tariffs were paused, the rare earth restrictions were lifted, and Trump rated that meeting a 12 out of 10. Now he's back in Beijing. First time on Chinese soil in 9 years, and the Strait of Hormuz is closed with the region embroiled in a war. Half of China's crude oil imports come from the Middle East, and right now, the Chinese tankers are stranded. Now, Trump had delayed this visit earlier in the year, expecting the war to resolve, but it hasn't. And the world then expected that Iran would obviously be on top of the agenda for this meeting as well, but it's not. Although what we have heard so far on Iran is that both leaders agreed that the Strait of Hormuz must remain open. But until then, let's shed a light on who Trump brought with him. Because they weren't diplomats, they were CEOs. Tim Cook, Elon Musk, Larry Fink of BlackRock, the heads of Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Boeing, Cargill, MasterCard, Citi. Huang wasn't even on the original invite list. He scrambled onto the plane during a stopover in Alaska. That scramble tells you everything about how much these companies need access to the Chinese market to survive. And there's another important issue. Xi opened the summit with a question. Can the US and China avoid the Thucydides trap? The historical pattern where a rising power and an established one almost always end up at war. If that Greek reference is confusing, don't worry, because then he said it plainly that the Chinese Taipei or Taiwan is the most important issue in this relationship. If mishandled, the two countries could, in his own words, collide or even come into conflict. Trump, when asked by reporters, changed the subject. So, to sum it up, this relationship has always been tricky. So far, it seems like the agenda is very trade and business focused. But here are some facts to think about who may have the upper hand. Beijing's trade surplus hit a record $1.2 trillion last year. It redirected its exports to the rest of the world, built energy pipelines through Central Asia, and stayed out of every war. Trump, on the other hand, arrived in Beijing with a 34% approval rating, gas at $4.48 a gallon, inflation at 3.8%, midterms in November with a desperate win needed, and Beijing knows that. But China isn't without its own vulnerabilities either. Half of its crude oil imports come from the Middle East. The closed strait is bleeding Chinese industry as well, which is why both leaders agreed publicly that the Strait of Hormuz must stay open. That's at least one thing that their interests align on perfectly. But otherwise, as one analyst put it, China can simply sit back and let the United States damage its own global standing.